In 1942, a German supply train carrying Tiger tanks toward the Eastern Front didn't explode because of a massive Allied bombing raid or a heroic cavalry charge. It exploded because a quiet man in a crumpled suit had walked past it on a platform in occupied France and dropped a piece of stationery into a coal tender. No wires, no clocks, no ticking. Just a tiny glass vial of acid and a thin wire of copper. By the time the train was 50 miles away, the time pencil had done its work, turning a marvel of German engineering into a jagged graveyard of steel. This is the story of the weapon the Abwehr couldn't find and the Baker Street irregulars who built it. Chapter 1. The Gadget in the Matchbox. The air in the basement of the Natural History Museum in London didn't smell like fossils or ancient dust. It smelled of cordite, industrial acid, and the cheap tobacco favored by Cecil Vandepeer Clarke. Clarke was not a soldier. He was a caravan designer and an engineer, a mechanical tinkerer who had been recruited by a shadowy organization known as MD1, or more colloquially, Churchill's Toyshop. "It's too simple," Colonel Jefferies said, peering through his spectacles at the small brass tube resting on the workbench. It was barely 5 inches long and thinner than a cigarette. "The Germans are looking for clockwork. They listen for the tick-tock of a bomb. They look for wires. What is this?" "This, Colonel," Clarke replied, his eyes gleaming with a manic energy, "is the switch number 10, but the boys in the lab call it the time pencil. It doesn't tick, it doesn't move, it just eats." The science of destruction. The weapon was a masterpiece of chemical simplicity. Inside the brass tube was a glass ampule filled with copper chloride, the acid, and a spring-loaded striker held back by a thin wire of high-tensile copper. The activation. You crushed the end of the tube, breaking the glass. The reaction. The acid began to dissolve the copper wire. The variable. Depending on the thickness of the wire and the concentration of the acid, you could set it to fire in 10 minutes, 2 hours, or 24 hours. "It's silent, it's cheap, and it's undetectable," Clarke whispered. "By the time the train is in the middle of a bridge or deep inside a tunnel, miles away from any suspicious activity, the wire snaps, the striker hits the priver, and boom." Chapter 2. The Ghost of the French Rails. Across the English Channel, the French resistance, the Maquis, were desperate. They were being slaughtered trying to blow up tracks with traditional dynamite. The Germans had security trains that patrolled the lines. If they saw a wire or a man with a heavy crate, they executed everyone in the nearest village. Then came the Special Operations Executive drops. Jean-Pierre, a former schoolteacher turned saboteur, received a shipment of what looked like office supplies. Along with the time pencils came the clam mine, a magnetic explosive the size of a paperback book. "We don't need to blow the tracks anymore," Jean-Pierre told his cell in a cellar in Lyon. "The tracks are guarded, the stations are guarded, but the trains have to stop for water and coal." The Lyon Incident. It was a Tuesday night. A German freight train, 40 cars long, sat idling at a siding. It was loaded with fuel drums destined for Rommel's panzer divisions in North Africa. Jean-Pierre didn't carry a gun. He carried a worker's lunch tin. He walked past the train, stumbled slightly, and slapped a clam mine onto the underside of a fuel tanker. He had already crushed the time pencil inside it. The L delay was set for 4 hours. Jean-Pierre walked away. He went home, ate soup with his wife, and went to bed. 4 hours later, 60 miles to the south, the train was crossing the Cise-Bolizon viaduct. The copper wire and the brass tube finally dissolved. The striker flew forward. The fuel tanker disintegrated, taking the bridge and the rest of the train with it. The German investigation found nothing. No bombers were overhead. No partisans had been seen near the bridge. To the Germans, it looked like a spontaneous mechanical failure or a devil's miracle. Chapter 3. The Logistics of Chaos. The genius of the time pencil wasn't just in the explosion, it was in the psychological warfare. Because the explosions happened miles away from the point of sabotage, the Gestapo couldn't figure out where the leak was. They began arresting their own engineers, accusing them of shoddy maintenance. Paranoia gripped the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Statistics of a silent war. Targeted asset. Method. Result. Locomotive boilers. Lumps of coal. Explosives painted black. Engine failure in deep tunnels. Bearings. Abrasive grease mixed with acid. Axles seized at high speeds, causing derailment. Ammunition cars. Clam mines and time pencils. Secondary explosions that leveled entire rail yards. By 1944, the British had manufactured 12 million time pencils. They were being dropped by the thousands over every occupied territory in Europe. Chapter 4. The Hunt for the Paperclip Bomb. In Berlin, the Abwehr finally got their hands on a dud. They studied the tiny brass tube. They were horrified. The British have turned chemistry into a sniper, a German colonel reportedly said. The Germans tried to create their own version, but their chemical industry, usually superior, struggled to find the right balance for the wire. The British toy makers had perfected the metallurgy so that it was even affected by temperature. They provided color-coded charts for different climates. As the Allies prepared for D-Day, the time pencils were the unsung heroes. On the night of June 5, 1944, the French resistance received the signal, the long sobs of the violins of autumn. Thousands of time pencils were activated at once. German reinforcements heading for the Normandy beaches found their trains exploding in tunnels, their trucks dying on the roads, and their communication lines severed by silent charges. The forgotten weapon had paralyzed the greatest army in the world. The legacy. After the war, the time pencil was mostly forgotten, replaced by electronic timers and remote detonators. But for a few years in the 1940s, the outcome of the war rested on a tiny piece of dissolving copper wire. It was a weapon that required no bravery in the heat of a firefight, but a cold, calculated courage. The courage to walk up to the enemy, plant a pencil, and walk away, knowing that miles away, the tick they couldn't hear was counting down the end of the Reich. Chapter 5. The Winter of the Alchemists. If the time pencil was a scalpel, the mission in Telemark, Norway, required a surgeon who could operate in a blizzard. The Germans were racing to build an atomic bomb. To do it, they needed heavy water, D2O, produced at the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork. The plant sat like a fortress on a jagged cliff, surrounded by ice and guarded by elite SS mountain troops. Conventional bombing had failed. The granite walls were too thick. The SOE sent in the gunner side team, 6 Norwegians trained in the art of the silent kill. In their kits, tucked next to their cyanide pills, were dozens of number 10 switches. The anatomy of a cold-weather kill. The engineers at Churchill's Toyshop had warned the team, acid moves slower in the cold. If the temperature dropped below freezing, the chemical reaction inside the time pencil could stall. To solve this, the saboteurs had to carry the fuses inside their thermal suits, using their own body heat to keep the acid alive until the very moment of placement. On February 27, 1943, the team scaled the 600-foot gorge, bypassed the guards, and crawled through a cable duct. Inside the high-concentration cells, they didn't use massive bundles of TNT. Instead, they placed small, concentrated charges directly onto the electrolysis chambers, primed with blue label time pencils, set for 30-minute delay. As they skied away into the dark, the silence of the Norwegian night was shattered. The pencils had snapped. The heavy water spilled into the drains. A Nazi nuclear dream died in a puddle on a concrete floor. Chapter 6. The L Delay and the Ghost Trains of Poland. As the narrative shifted to 1944, the war of logistics moved to the Eastern Front. The Soviet advance was being hammered by German supply lines that seemed infinite. Enter the L Delay, the successor to the time pencil. While the original number 10 relied on acid, the L Delay used a lead wire system that stretched under spring tension until it snapped. It was even more stable and could be set for up to 28 days. The long fuse strategy. In Poland, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, began a campaign known as Operation Ribbon. They weren't looking to blow up trains in the stations anymore. They wanted to kill them in the dead zones, stretches of track hundreds of miles from the nearest repair depot. 1. The drop. A partisan disguised as a railway greaser would apply a clam mine to the axle box of a freight car. 2. The wait. The L Delay was set for 5 days. 3. The ghost journey. The train would travel through Germany, past security checkpoints, and deep into the marshes of Belarus. 4. The snap. 5 days later, in the middle of a strategic bottleneck, the lead wire would finally succumb to the tension. The resulting derailment would block the only supply artery for an entire army group for weeks. The Germans were fighting a ghost war. They were losing tanks and ammo to a weapon that had been planted 1,000 miles away by a man they never saw. Chapter 7. The Paranoia of the Reichsbahn. By mid-1944, the psychological toll on German rail workers was catastrophic. The Reichsbahn implemented a 10-foot rule. Any worker caught within 10 feet of a locomotive without a direct supervisor was shot on sight. But you couldn't guard 10,000 miles of track. The British began dropping explosive coal. These were cast-iron casings shaped and painted to look exactly like lumps of anthracite coal. Inside was a high explosive charge and, you guessed it, a time pencil. A partisan would toss a single lump into a station's coal pile. Eventually, a fireman would shovel that lump into the furnace of a locomotive. As the fire burned away the outer casing, the time pencil would reach its critical temperature and detonate inside the boiler. The result wasn't just a fire, it was a boiler explosion, the equivalent of a small nuclear blast inside the cab of the train. Steam at 300 psi would shred everything in a 50-yard radius. Chapter 8. The American Connection, OSS. While the British SOE invented the pencil, the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, refined the art of the silent bang for the Pacific theater. General Will Bill Donovan saw the success in Europe and ordered 1 million units for use in occupied China and Burma. The Americans added a twist. They developed a fluorescent dye that would leak out of the fuse if it had been tampered with, warning the operative if the pencil was a dud. In the jungles of Burma, Merrill's marauders used these silent timers to take out Japanese bridges. They didn't need heavy artillery. They just needed a man with a pencil and a dream of chaos. The Silent Architect, Cecil Vandepeer Clarke. Behind all this was the man from the first chapter, Cecil Clarke. By 1945, he was a decorated hero, though his name remained out of the newspapers. He had proven that in modern warfare, a chemist in a basement could be more dangerous than a general on a battlefield. As the war reached its fever pitch in 1945, the time pencil was no longer just a tool of sabotage. It became a weapon of assassination and high-stakes espionage. The story moves from the rail yards to the very corridors of power. Chapter 9. The Lady in the Library. In the winter of 1944, a woman named Elise, an American-born operative for the OSS, walked through the ruins of Berlin. To the German soldiers, she was just another displaced civilian, a librarian working to salvage culturally significant texts from the bombed-out wreckage of the Prussian State Library. In her leather satchel, she carried a copy of Goethe's Faust, but the center of the book had been meticulously hollowed out. Inside lay 6 number 10 switches and a pound of plastic explosive. The Berlin Protocol. Elise's target wasn't a train, it was a telephone exchange hub located in a bunker beneath the Wilhelmstrasse. This hub carried the direct lines from Hitler's Führer bunker to the commanders on the Western Front. She knew she couldn't just walk in and blow it up. She needed to be gone long before the fire started. On a Tuesday afternoon, during a shift change, Elise slipped into the ventilation room of the exchange. She didn't plant a massive bomb. She placed 3 small charges on the main cooling pumps. She crushed the white label pencils, set for a 24-hour delay. 24 hours later, Elise was already on a train heading toward the Swiss border. Back in Berlin, the copper wires inside the brass tubes finally surrendered to the acid. The cooling pumps failed, the exchange overheated, and the subsequent explosions severed communication between Berlin and the front lines for 36 critical hours. In the world of war, 36 hours of silence is an eternity. Chapter 10. The Battle of the Bulge, the Logistics Nightmare. While Elise worked in the shadows, the pencil was about to face its largest tactical challenge, Operation Herbstnebel, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had hoarded fuel for months for their final Hail Mary offensive. They moved this fuel in massive fuel trains that traveled only at night to avoid Allied planes. The SOE and OSS coordinated a wall of fire strategy. They didn't hit the trains at the front, they hit the water towers. The water tower trap. A steam locomotive is a thirsty beast. It needs thousands of gallons of water every 100 miles. Saboteurs used time pencils to rig the valves of the giant water towers along the Rhine. The tactic? The pencil wouldn't blow the tower, it would blow the release valve hours after the partisans had left. The result? By the time the German fuel trains arrived, the towers were empty. The locomotives ran dry. Hundreds of Tiger tanks were left abandoned on the snowy roads of the Ardennes, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because their blood, the fuel, was stuck on a train sitting idle 500 miles away because a 5-inch brass tube had emptied a water tank in the middle of the night. Chapter 11. The Ultimate Unsolved Mystery. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, they discovered something chilling. In the secret archives of the Abwehr, they found thousands of reports of spontaneous combustion in German munitions factories. The Germans had spent millions of Reichsmarks investigating their own workers for laziness and incompetence, never realizing that the accidents were being caused by a weapon that looked like a common office supply. The British toy makers had even developed a version of the time pencil that was non-magnetic, made of glass and plastic, so that even the most advanced German minesweepers couldn't find them. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Cecil Vandepeer. When the war ended in May 1945, the time pencil was quietly retired. The advent of the transistor and digital timers made chemical fuses look like ancient relics. Cecil Vandepeer Clarke returned to his caravans, and the SOE was officially disbanded. But the impact was undeniable. General Dwight E. Eisenhower later remarked that the disruption of French rail lines, largely achieved through silent sabotage, shortened the war in Europe by at least 6 months. Final tally of the toy. Production, over 12 million units. Success rate, approximately 85%. Temperature variance caused some duds. Cost, roughly $1.50 per unit in 1940s currency. Damage, billions of dollars in German infrastructure, thousands of lost locomotives, and an unquantifiable amount of psychological terror. The forgotten weapon proved that in the theater of war, sometimes the loudest statement is made by the smallest, quietest tick. The war didn't end with a bang for the time pencil. It ended with a whisper that echoed into the Cold War. As the Iron Curtain began to fall, the secret of the switch number 10 transitioned from a tool of liberation to a tool of deep state chess. Chapter 13. The Museum of Shadows. Today, if you walk through the Imperial War Museum in London or the CIA's private museum in Langley, Virginia, you might see a small, unassuming brass tube tucked behind reinforced glass. It looks like a Victorian medical instrument or a discarded fountain pen. Most tourists walk right past it. But to those in the intelligence community, that little tube represents the birth of asymmetric warfare. The Cold War transition. In 1946, as the Western Allies and the Soviets began to eye each other with suspicion, the pencil didn't disappear. The British MI6 and the newly formed CIA realized that if they ever had to fight a hot war against the USSR, they wouldn't use massive bomber fleets, they would use the pencils. During the early 1950s, stay-behind networks, clandestine cells across Europe, were trained to use a modernized version of the time pencil. These cells were instructed that if the Soviet Red Army ever rolled into West Germany, they were to become ghosts. They would let the tanks pass, then use the silent chemistry of the time pencil to destroy the fuel lines and bridges behind them. Chapter 14. The science that changed everything. Why does this forgotten weapon matter to a modern audience in the USA? Because it changed the way we think about technology and power. Before the time pencil, power was measured by the size of your battleship or the caliber of your cannon. After the time pencil, the world learned that information and chemistry were the true equalizers. The pencil legacy in modern tech. Delayed action, the concept of logic bombs in cybersecurity, code that sits dormant for months before activating, is the direct digital descendant of the time pencil. Miniaturization, the push to make weapons smaller and more portable started in Cecil Clarke's Toyshop. The psychological edge. It taught military strategists that making an enemy paranoid is often more effective than making them bleed. Chapter 15. The Final Tick. The story of the time pencil concludes not with a grand explosion, but with a quiet realization. In the final days of 1945, a crate of unused number 10 switches was found in a warehouse in Liverpool. They were scheduled to be melted down for scrap. An old sergeant who had seen the pencils work their magic in the fields of France took one and placed it in his pocket. Years later, his grandson found it in an attic. He thought it was just an old piece of stationery. He didn't know that inside that tube was the ghost of a revolution, the silent chemistry that had once brought the most powerful railway in history to its knees. The Forgotten Weapon Quick Reference Table. Feature. Details. Inventor, Cecil Vandepeer Clarke. a caravan designer. Total produced, 12 million. Biggest success? Paralyzing German logistics during D-Day. Key weakness, extreme cold, below freezing, slowed the acid. Legacy, father of modern clandestine sabotage tools. Epilogue, a toast to the tinkers. The forgotten British weapon was never meant to be famous. It was designed to be invisible, to do its job, and to disappear into the wreckage it created. It was the weapon of the teacher, the librarian, the railway greaser, and the quiet engineer. In an age of drones and satellite strikes, there is something hauntingly beautiful about a weapon that relied on a single thin wire of copper and the slow, steady drip of acid. It was a weapon that proved once and for all that even the greatest empires can be toppled by a pencil if you know exactly where to write the end of the story. Since we have covered the war and its immediate aftermath, we move into the final, most mysterious phase, the ghost in the machine. This is where the time pencil's DNA transitioned from a physical object into a doctrine of modern warfare. Chapter 16, The Stay Behind Legacy. In the late 1940s, as the smoke cleared, the British and Americans didn't just throw away the blueprints for the number 10 switch, they evolved them. Under the top-secret Operation Gladio, the Western Allies established stay-behind armies across Europe. Their primary tool for the second resistance, in case of a Soviet invasion, was a refined version of the time pencil. These new models replaced the corrosive acid with a more stable synthetic polymer that wasn't as sensitive to the freezing temperatures of a Russian winter. The secret caches. In the forests of West Germany and the mountains of Italy, thousands of sabotage kits were buried in pressurized containers. Each kit contained 20 pounds of PE4 plastic explosive, 50 magnetic clam mines, and 100 L-delay and number 10 pencils. These caches remained hidden for decades. Even today, construction crews in Europe occasionally dig up a rusted metal box containing the silent ticks of a war that never happened. Chapter 17, The Modern Echo, From Acid to Silicon. How does a 1940s brass tube relate to a 21st century American audience? The time pencil was the first fire-and-forget weapon for the common person. It shifted the power dynamic from the professional soldier to the partisan. It was the ancestor of the modern IED, improvised explosive device, and more importantly, the psychological blueprint for cyber sabotage. The Stuxnet connection. In 2010, a digital virus called Stuxnet crippled Iranian nuclear centrifuges. It didn't blow them up with a bomb. It made them spin slightly too fast until they self-destructed over months. Military historians call Stuxnet the digital time pencil. Just like Cecil Clarke's invention, it, 1, was planted long before it activated, 2, was silent and undetectable during its countdown, 3, caused the enemy to blame their own equipment for the failure. Chapter 18, The Final Toll of Cecil's Gadget. When Cecil Vandepeer Clarke passed away in 1960, he took many secrets to his grave. He never saw himself as a merchant of death. He saw himself as a problem solver. To him, the time pencil was a way to save Allied lives by ensuring the enemy never made it to the beachhead. The Forgotten Statistics. The Invisible Air Force. It is estimated that sabotage caused by the time pencil and its variants destroyed more German rolling stock than 3 full months of Allied strategic bombing in 1943. And the cost efficiency. while a B-17 bomber cost $250,000 to build and risked 10 lives per mission. A $1.50 time pencil delivered by a local postman could achieve the same result with zero risk to Allied flight crews. Conclusion: the pencil is mightier than the sword. The story of the time pencil reminds us that the greatest innovations aren't always the biggest or the most expensive. Sometimes they're the simplest: a piece of glass, a drop of acid, and a spring. It made German railway trains explode miles from the battle, but more importantly, it proved that ingenuity is the ultimate weapon. It turned every railway worker into a soldier and every station into a battlefield. The next time you look at a simple ballpoint pen, remember that in the hands of the Baker Street irregulars, a similar-looking object once changed the course of world history, one silent chemical tick at a time.